Welcome to the Is It Time for a Lawyer podcast with attorney George Lamb. Each brief episode will focus on a specific legal topic to help you better understand the situation you're in and what your next steps might be. Let's join George for this episode. And friends, welcome back to the podcast. We're in the studio with attorney George Lamb. George, how are you, guy?
I'm good. How are you?
Man, I'm doing fine. So for the last 9 issues, we've actually focused more on family law, but today we're going to start to deviate and jump into personal injury. And you have a practice that basically handles car wrecks, motorcycle wrecks, trucks wrecks, the other areas of personal injury. But today, let's just kind of do an overview of motor vehicle accidents. Sound good?
Sounds good to me.
All right. So, what you've probably had this conversation with your clients many, many times. It ultimately is going to come down to insurance. And that's what a lot of people really don't understand is how important insurance is really to this whole area of law, any kind of motor vehicle accident claim.
Yeah, that's very true. So what happens is that if you're injured in a motor vehicle accident, be it a car accident, a motorcycle accident, a truck accident, any kind of motor vehicle accident, a lot of what's going to go on involves insurance. And a lot of people think that it is the other person's insurance. Let's just assume that the other person's at fault and that liability is clear, which can be an issue. A lot of people think, well, the other insurance is going to pay for it. And that's not immediate. That doesn't mean that that's not going to happen, but that's not immediate. In Kentucky, we're a no-fault state. And so we're required to carry PIP, which is personal injury protection. It's also called no-fault insurance. And every driver in Kentucky is supposed to have it. There is an exception for motorcycle riders. But for the most part, everybody has PIP. You have to have a minimum of $10,000. You can buy more. And it covers you, and it covers the people in your vehicle.
And I think that's what surprises people when they start getting into this topic, if they ever have to tap into this. It's not $10,000 that's divided among everybody in the car. It's everybody in the car typically has up to $10,000, at least initially, of coverage for medical bills, some lost wages, and a few other things. But it's primarily medical bills.
It's primarily medical bills, but what you can do, and we can talk about it later, is that you have a right to direct those benefits. And so you probably need somebody to help manage that. And so that $10,000 can go further if you're managing it than not. You can use it for lost wages. You can use it for out-of-pocket expenses. You can use it for medical expenses. And you get to pick how you want to allocate those benefits. And, attorneys like myself, we know how to work through that.
The nice thing is you can actually get medical treatment. You don't have to wait. As you said earlier, none of this is really going to be paid out until the end if you can prove liability and negligence. This allows you to go get some medical treatment and not have to worry about, geez, how am I going to pay for those bills? Well, you've got approximately $10,000 there that's going to cover most of those initial issues that you might run into.
Correct. And what happens is that the medical providers that treat people for motor vehicle accidents are accustomed to this. So they're familiar with what PIP is. There's an application that needs to be filled out. You have to open up a claim. There's certain steps that need to be taken. But once you get that going, yes, they do accept it as part of payment for medical treatment.
And friends, before I forget this, at the end of today's episode, George is going to give you 4 specific tips for things that you need to do at the accident scene, and one of them is directly related to that PIP in the medical treatment. But again, if you'll hold on to the end here, we'll go through that as well. So, George, let's come back to this. So, your driver, your people in the car, they all have the PIP insurance, and that is up to $10,000 typically. Like you said, you can increase that if you talk to your insurance agent and say, hey, I want more PIP. You're just going to pay a little bit more on your premium, but it is possible. But it's a great safety net.
It is, and it's required. And so a lot of people don't even know how this works. And so it's kind of what we had just spoken about. The assumption is I'm not at fault in an accident. I've incurred expenses. I'm just going to send the bill to the other insurance company and they're going to pay. The problem with that is that they're not going to pay immediately. And it might not be time to submit all your information to them to maximize the recovery you would get from what we would call the fault party. There's also other levels of insurance. So when you're talking about motor vehicle accidents and you're talking about insurance, you would have the fault party, the person that's responsible for the accident. You would have your insurance, which would be personal injury protection, PIP, or no fault. You could also have sometimes the limits of insurance that the other person has isn't enough, or maybe they don't have insurance. So you could purchase underinsured motorist coverage, uninsured motorist coverage at different levels. The minimum coverage that somebody's supposed to have is $25,000 as far as what liability coverage you're supposed to carry on your vehicles. Another thing that we need to touch on is property damage. And so what happens is that if you're injured in a motor vehicle accident, you've likely had a property damage loss, and the fault party actually does pay for that immediately. Those are things that if you file a claim for property damage with the fault party, that you would work with them to either repair your car, maybe put you in a rental car, depending upon the situation. Sometimes your car's totaled. Then they would have a total loss evaluation that you would have to work through. So there is a level of insurance with regard to property damage that we need to touch on as well.
And George, let me transition to a slightly different topic. If somebody is traveling, and let's say I live in Kentucky, I'm insured out of the state of Kentucky, and I'm heading down to Florida and I get in an accident. My insurance obviously goes with me. I'm going to have my Kentucky insurance down there, but the case itself is going to be handled in Florida, correct?
Yes, Florida would have jurisdiction over that accident. So if somebody is traveling out of state and they're from here and they call me and they say, what do I do? Then I would try to connect them with a Florida attorney for that part of the claim. Or for that claim. The reverse is true. If somebody is out of state and they're traveling in Kentucky, I would help them with that because it would be a Kentucky case.
So if I live in Detroit, I'm traveling to Nashville, I get in a wreck within the state of Kentucky, again, you can handle that case.
That's correct. And then there's certain parts of it, your PIP may apply even if you're out of state. And so you would want somebody that's familiar with Kentucky law as well as whatever other jurisdiction you're in and vice versa, because there would be things that need to be handled.
Okay. So, we talked about the liability. You've used that a couple of times. I guess the number one issue here is really proving the negligence, right?
It is.
Who's at fault?
Correct. And so if you're gonna recover for damages in a motor vehicle accident, you're gonna have to prove that somebody had a duty, that they breached that duty, that it caused your damages, and that you had damages. But without proving negligence, you're not going to get anywhere. So you do have to prove that the other person's responsible for the accident. And that would be in a later episode, but that's basically what you're talking about in Kentucky. And then some people ask the question, well, what if I was at fault, or what if I was partially at fault? And so that happens. We're a true comparative fault state, and that's based on a percentage that's allocated. So if they allocate fault among the parties, maybe one person's 50% at fault, the other person's 50% at fault. Maybe it's 90-10. That would be meted out later. But the takeaway is that in some states, if you are any percent at fault, your claim is barred. That's not our case. There's other thresholds in between where the other person has to be at least 51% at fault for you to recover. That's not how it is in Kentucky. It's a true comparative fault state based on your percentage of fault.
So again, where that's really going to come into play is my damages could be reduced by a percent, and that would depend on how much the court said, well, you were at fault, say 20%. Okay, so my damages could actually be reduced, I guess, 20%, and the other party could file a claim against me for that 20% because technically I'm at fault for 20%?
I don't know that they would file a claim. I think that they would be your award would be reduced, not that they would file a claim against you. So what happened? They could try, I suppose, but that's not the way I would look at that as a general case. The way I would look at it is, and a lot of the times somebody's 100% at fault, and so I'm just trying to highlight a nuance to this because it comes up, and so people should know it. But yes, you do have to prove negligence in a motor vehicle case, in any kind of personal injury case. It's a little different. In contrast, in a workers' compensation case, for example, you just have to be on the job working. You don't have that. You have to be on the job working in order to recover in comp. That's kind of how that's meted out. This is a little different, but somebody is going to have to be at fault for the accident. You're going to have to prove it.
Well, and that is a perfect segue as we begin to wrap up the episode here in terms of some tips for anyone who's at the scene of an accident, who's been in a car accident, a motorcycle accident, trucking accident. And some of this does go down to helping prove that fault or prove that negligence. George, let's talk about these 4 fairly basic tips. I mean, there are a lot more of them, but I think for this episode, let's focus on these 4.
Okay. First thing you want to do is you don't admit fault, number 1, because you just want to stick to facts. Okay. You don't want to make judgments. Check and see if people are okay. I mean, that's probably the first and most important thing is everybody okay? You don't want to make judgments. You just want to collect facts. Everybody generally has a phone. And so it's a good idea to take pictures of your vehicle. It's important to take pictures of the other vehicle because that can be pretty valuable evidence. You would want to take pictures of the scene. You would want to document injuries. Some people take videos. There's a lot of things that you can do, and everybody has a phone, and it's a great resource. If there's witnesses around and you can kind of get some names of some witnesses, that can be a good thing. You would want to call the authorities. You would want to get a police report. Some people are reluctant to do that. And so what happens is they try to exchange information. They might text each other information, but the police report's a really good resource. You won't get it right away. You'll get a report number that you can get. It's relatively inexpensive. We can get those. But it'll have all the information that you need. Most importantly, it'll have insurance information. It'll have where the car's registered. It'll have the owner. It'll have all sorts of things that you may not get on a little slip piece of paper from somebody that you had an accident with. And so it's important to do that. The other thing is if you're injured, you need to seek medical treatment immediately. And that kind of goes into the PIP. And so you can use your PIP for that treatment. And you want to use a medical provider that's accustomed to seeing people like this. Emergency room.
And why is that?
Because they're prepared to die. They see these things all the time, every day. They have the resources. They have the resources in those facilities to address things. They have different types of specialties there, depending upon what your injuries are. They have diagnostic equipment. They're just prepared to handle it.
That makes sense. So they're a little bit more efficient, and you're not referring you out to, okay, you need to go out and get an MRI. Well, they probably have an MRI set up right there in the building.
If it warrants that.
Yeah.
But you want to use medical providers that are accustomed to dealing with these types of cases.
Well, so the person that comes to mind for me actually is your family doctor, but while that might be beneficial, it's not always as beneficial as the ER, right?
I think that's true. Family doctor, when I think of that, I think of cold, flu, high blood pressure, diabetes. That's not what I think of when I think of, being injured in an accident. That's just not the first place I would go. Now, if that's what's available to you, sure, if you need to document your injuries, but that wouldn't be my first course, no.
Well, when you're dealing with your family doctor, I think the importance here is letting them know that you were in an accident. You want that documentation, and we'll talk about that down the road here, but you really want to make sure that the record reflects that, yeah, these injuries were the result of an accident or some kind of collision, right?
You want to do what you can to tell your story, and you're the only person that can tell it. And so what I recommend that people do is that if you're injured in a motor vehicle accident or truck accident or a motorcycle accident, that you focus on, what your injuries are and tell them all your injuries. And you may not know them all that moment, but over the course of time, in a day or two, you might have injuries that manifest that you didn't know. Your adrenaline's pumping. If you've ever been in a car accident, your adrenaline's pumping and then it wears off. And then you might find that there's injuries that you didn't necessarily recognize right at the outset, but shortly thereafter, and you need to communicate that with medical providers to document those injuries.
That makes sense. You want to get it into the record because that's going to be part of the claim that you're going to file on their behalf to say, look, these injuries are directly related to that collision.
That's correct.
So you're trying to establish that paper trail. The other one out there is chiropractors. That's another source of medical treatment, and they probably are somewhat familiar with accident victims.
They are familiar with accident victims, and they are familiar with PIP, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, George, I mean, this is more of a brief overview. In subsequent episodes, we're going to dive a little bit more deeper. We're going to come back and talk about the uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage. We're going to probably talk about motorcycle PIP and that loophole that you mentioned. And we'll get into a whole bunch of other issues related to motor vehicle accidents. But if someone wants to get in touch with you, somebody has questions, somebody has been in an accident, needs representation, how can they do that?
Easiest way, you can call or text me at 502-640-9797. You can email me at george@lambandlamb.com, or you can check out my website at lambandlamb.com. Any way works.
Outstanding. George, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it, guy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Is It Time for a Lawyer podcast with attorney George Lamb. We hope you found the discussion informative and helpful. The comments George made are not meant to be legal advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship. However, if it is time for a lawyer, George is ready to listen. Be sure to share this episode on your social media. George will be back in 2 weeks with his next episode. Thanks again for listening.